Welcome back to my channel. For those of you that are new here, I'm Dr. Ami Patel, pharmacist and fellow sister. In today's video, I'm excited to have with me Dr. Pooja Mahtani. She is a functional medicine nutritionist and also a pharmacist, and we have a lot of the same story about our personal PCOS and our goals of, helping women with hormone health. So I'm really excited to finally be able to have a conversation with her and connect with her here. So Pooja, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So today our conversation is mostly going to be focused on the impact of gut health on PCOS. So I'll give a little introduction about Pooja. She is a pharmacist and functional medicine nutritionist, like I mentioned, and she's the founder of Pooja Mahtani Wellness, a virtual functional nutrition practice specializing in women's health. And like I mentioned, it's because of her own health struggles with PCOS, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and irritable bowel syndrome that she discovered the immense healing power of food, and she now makes it her goal and mission to help women achieve hormone health as well. So Pooja, I'm excited that we can talk about in detail about PCOS, and we have a lot of similarities. So we can get started. Tell us a little bit about your health challenges and what you did to take control of your health.
Yeah, I would love to share a little bit more about myself. I was actually diagnosed with PCOS and fatty liver disease, and I had a lot of digestive issues at the time, and I was diagnosed at my last year of pharmacy school, believe it or not. So that was now over.
Me too, actually. Oh. Yeah, I was diagnosed with PCOS in my last year of pharmacy school too.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, for me, that was like 10 years ago now, which I've found ancient. But that's 10 years ago, that's when I was diagnosed. I kind of had a little bit of a traditional route to diagnosis. I actually was probably struggling with symptoms for several years prior to that, which is the case for most people.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I was actually in India and I was diagnosed. I went to see a dermatologist for an unrelated reason. And he was the one that actually diagnosed me with PCOS first. And then I came back to the States and I went through my primary care provider. I went through an endocrinologist, and they confirmed everything through blood testing and an ultrasound of my ovaries and all that. So it was definitely spot on, the diagnosis. And I kind of took the pharmaceutical approach first, right? I don't know if that was your story as well, but as most of our as most of conventional medicine, there really are only a few options to move forward with, right? You have birth control and you have metformin and spironolactone. So I tried all three in combination or in, with one or the other at some point in the very beginning. And that's also what I knew at that point, was my final year, having just graduated. Right. I felt pretty confident that approach would work for me. And I kind of maintained with that, or went with that for several years. I didn't think too much of it. But something kind of, then in my mid-20s, I feel like something, there was this inner awakening, I guess, where I felt compelled to dig a little bit deeper, because I really started questioning well, how long? I think I was just frustrated at that point. Do I have to take this forever? Is this just how my story looks now? Is there no other way for me to manage it? So that's when I started digging a little bit deeper, and I actually I recalled what my endocrinologist said, and the only parting words that she gave me after my diagnosis was that I would need to go on a really low carb diet, because my PCOS subtype was of the insulin resistance type. And
Mhm.
so, it took me a couple years to come back to her words. And at that point, I was like, okay, let me start digging into this. Like, what does she mean by that? And now I feel like it's pretty amazing the amount of research and like just content that is
Yeah.
available to the general public, like things that you're doing, for example,
Oh, thank you.
having this channel and all these different blogs that I'm reading online. And it's
Mhm.
just like the awareness has skyrocketed with the help of social media. But believe it
Mhm.
or not, like even just maybe 5 to 7 years ago, it wasn't to this degree. And so I literally went to the library and I got books on like blood sugar. It wasn't
Mhm.
on PCOS, it was on like blood sugar imbalance because
Right.
when she reiterated the insulin resistance piece of it. So that's where I started to do my, I guess, informal studying and training. I was N of 1.
Mhm.
I was just hoping that something that I could change with the way I was eating would help me. And
Right.
fast forward like a year or two into that sort of self exploration and learning a lot more about nutrition, um, I was able to apply a lot of the principles that I learned on myself. And believe it or not, um, I mean, I guess you can believe it because it was powerful enough for me to change careers, but I
Yeah.
felt like it changed my entire life. Like, I was like, how come no one knows about this? And why is
Yeah.
it that, it, why is it that we're given such confusing dietary advice? It seems, um, once I kind of handle of it, like the pathophysiology of PCOS, and then in turn, the type of dietary approach I should be taking, it just all
Right.
seems to make a lot more sense. And so
Mhm.
I kind of took that, my experiment, and I was wanting to go deeper into it. And that's when
Mhm.
I chose to formalize my education, and I went back to get my master's in nutrition. And then I stumbled across the science of functional medicine
Mm.
and kind of went deep into that world. And I'm still learning. I don't think once you're in this space, you ever stop learning, because there's
Yeah.
new stuff that comes out all the
Which
time.
is
And
good now because, like you said, there wasn't anything before, but now, thank God, finally there is more research coming out regarding
exactly.
all of this.
Yep, exactly. So that's kind of my story. I hope I answered the question. But I feel like I've reached a point where I'm really confident in my approach to help myself, of course. But then now that I have this formalized education as on top of that, on top of my own experiment of me, that I'm able to use a lot of these same principles and help a lot of other women that are struggling with PCOS and Hashimoto's and other hormonal imbalances and related conditions. So
Right. No, that's awesome. And the work you're doing is great too. It's interesting that I feel like, a lot of women that I connect with that have PCOS, a lot of it comes from their own struggles because unfortunately, like you said, we weren't getting the help that we needed or, not finding medicine like birth control, metformin and spironolactone enough for, treating us. And so we kind of had to take things into our own hands.
and it sounds a little ironic because we both have
I
pharmacy
know.
backgrounds.
I know, trust me. And,
Like medication was not enough. It's not to say that medication doesn't do its job. It
yeah.
clearly can be effective, but
Hmm.
um, I guess if I can speak
Yeah.
for
Yeah,
both,
of course.
we both realize that there's more that could be done from a preventative point of view.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I mean, for some people, medicine may be enough and it may work for them, but for us, it wasn't. And yeah, like, finishing pharmacy school, I was on birth control for like 7 years. I didn't even think too much of it. And then it was, like you said, when things weren't getting better, I'm like, there has to be more than just being on this medication. And it's not even really helping, I feel like, after a certain point for me.
Right.
So you also talk, or you've also had experience with like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and irritable bowel syndrome. I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit on that since we're going to get into more of gut health.
Yeah. So the fatty liver disease is actually an extension of the PCOS, believe it or not. They share the same underlying root cause, which is, at least
Mm.
in my case, it was the insulin resistance. So the glucose that was like glucose, and I should back up a little bit. The carbohydrates I was eating would turn into glucose in my body, as it would in most individuals or every human being. But the issue is that that glucose is not getting transported into the cell,
Mm.
because you need insulin to help escort glucose into the to help escort glucose to go into the cell. But if your cell is insulin resistant, then all of a sudden that insulin um, communication with the cell isn't as great. So a lot of the glucose ends up just staying in the bloodstream versus getting into the cell itself. And when you have a lot of it in the bloodstream, the body will find a way to get rid of it essentially because they can't stay
Right.
in the bloodstream forever. So it has to have kind of a backup mechanism. So a lot of that excess glucose then gets rerouted to the liver and it gets stored in the liver for future use.
Mm.
Um, and that's good in a sense because if we were to ever go through like a famine or
Right.
go through a couple days of not eating, then
Hmm.
that backup reserve kind of kicks in. But if this is happening day in and day out, all of a sudden your liver will reach capacity pretty quickly, and then everything
Mm.
beyond that is then converted into fat in the liver. And so
Mm.
the liver becomes super sluggish. It's not able to do its job effectively, namely detoxification. So
Right.
that fatty liver disease is kind of a big deal. So I
Yeah.
always assess when I'm working with clients their liver markers because I want to make sure
Mm.
that do they fall in that same position or do they have a healthy functioning liver because it has such a big role to play in glucose regulation. So that's kind of the background there. And then
Mhm.
in terms of like, how did I address it? It really was this dietary change that I made. So eating more whole foods, low glycemic,
Mhm.
fiber-rich foods, less processed, less
Mhm.
inflammatory foods like gluten and dairy. For me, that seemed to be quite effective.
Mhm.
And then it was that change with my diet that not only helped my PCOS symptoms, but my like a future like an ultrasound that I did maybe a few years later on my liver showed that the
Okay.
fatty deposits were completely gone.
Oh, that's awesome. That's
Yeah,
so interesting too. That's like not something I feel like is talked about enough with PCOS
right.
amongst a lot of things. But yeah, that too. I didn't actually know a lot of that. So
Yeah. Yeah, and it's actually more common than I guess we all think it is, but like
yeah.
it's just that correlation isn't discussed nearly enough.
Yeah, I
So,
think it's more like surface level, like, oh, like lose weight and acne and hair. Cause you can see that, but like fatty liver, you don't see it. Like you can't visualize it unless you do an ultrasound or you get labs done or things like that.
yep, exactly. And then the IBS piece was only more of a recent, like the last few years that I realized was more of there was a connection between PCOS, um, in the sense that women with PCOS are more likely to have IBS.
Mhm.
And the reason for that is because one of the underlying causes for developing or worsening PCOS symptoms is a poor gut microbiome. And
Mhm.
that in turn can affect not only like your reproductive and your metabolic symptoms that come from the PCOS world, but also just like digestively speaking, things may not be things may not be operating as optimally
Right.
as they could be. So I know we're going to kind of dive into that world
Yeah.
for the rest of this talk, but I feel like I hit the trifecta.
No, definitely. Yeah. Well, it's good that, I mean, it's crazy because sometimes, like, like you said, you went to India just to figure out the acne situation. And a lot of times it's focused on, like, oh, just the problem that you see on the surface. But there's so many other things that are related, like gut health and PCOS, that, also most people don't know about, or there's not enough information on that. So, is there anything else you wanted to mention about the relationship between gut health and PCOS?
Well, I can definitely touch on the cool research that's
Oh,
coming out.
yeah,
That's
definitely.
like because it
Yeah.
wasn't again this angle of PCOS, I feel like, is relatively new. So you won't see like tons of paper on it going back like 30, 40 years like you do with the insulin resistance piece of it.
Right.
This is like all within the last probably 2, 3, 4 years even.
Hmm.
But
That's
we know now that at least there's a correlation now that women with PCOS have a compromised gut microbiome, meaning that you can consider like poor gut health as an underlying factor for
mm,
having worse PCOS symptoms. But it's interesting when I read these studies, because at the end of the day, you can have all of these different pieces of the puzzle contribute to PCOS, but it's still, the solution is still the same, right? It's the fiber rich, whole foods,
mhm,
minimally processed diet is what's going to help with your improving your gut microbiome. It's going to help with the insulin resistance. It's going to help with lowering your androgen levels. So it's kind of like, even though we're uncovering more about the disease state itself, the quote unquote solution hasn't changed. It's still the same, right? But I think it's just we're getting more evidence to showcase that PCOS is in fact quite a complex condition, and it can affect every body system. It's not just kind of like what you said earlier, like surface level symptoms. It goes a lot
yeah.
deeper than that. So yeah, so women do with PCOS do tend to have a more of this like disrupted, altered, or compromised gut microbiome. And the cool data now is showing that that they've done a couple experiments. This is, at
Hmm.
least to my knowledge, in mouse models only to date,
Hmm.
but they've done actually like fecal microbiome transplantation um,
Mm,
in mice with PCOS. So they've had like two groups. One group they
right.
did that fecal microbiome transplantation. One group they didn't. And what they found was that once they were able to transplant a really healthy microbe population
Hmm.
in the mice, in the half of that study population, they were able to basically protect themselves from developing PCOS like traits compared to
Oh,
the other
wow.
mice that were never exposed um, to yeah, that fecal transplantation. Now, in reality, what does that mean for all of us? I think we're a long ways away from getting a fecal transplantation.
Yeah.
It does happen in certain clinics around the country, around the world, but it's very, very limited in its use. Like it's very
Hmm.
like the most common reason for it right now would be like for a C. diff infection.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
it's not just like you can just walk into any clinic and ask
Yeah.
for a fecal microbiome transplantation. But I think the cool thing is that we do know by working on
Yeah.
your gut, by improving the composition of the flora that reside in your microbiome, you can in fact improve your PCOS symptoms. So we can talk about ways that we can do that at home, right? Like
Yeah.
eating and
Good idea.
through supplements and things like that. But I just thought that was super, super neat.
No, that's really significant because it's showing that it's because like it's frustrating because the focus, I mean, there's a lot of frustrations with PCOS, the lack of research and all of that. And but it's even more frustrating, like the main focus is lose weight, lose weight, lose weight. Your PCOS will get better, but that's like not even completely true because like the weight is a result of having PCOS. It's not the other way around. Like, oh, you gain weight, so you have PCOS. And so now it's like it's significant, the research, because it is showing that if we can improve something else like our gut, then we can improve a lot of our PCOS.
Right. Yep. 100%.
So how can someone tell if they have like an impaired gut or digestive system, or is it like, oh, because you have PCOS, like everyone has impaired gut?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So there's a little bit of a distinction I want to make here, um, because you could have someone that has PCOS and they could tell you, well, I have very minimal digestive issues. And that yet that person inherently by having PCOS I already know as soon as they walk into my practice that they have a compromised gut microbiome.
Mm.
So the distinction being that you, when we talk about gut health, it's such a big, wide umbrella term, and there's so many aspects that fall under that. One aspect being digestive symptoms like gas, bloating, bowel like frequency. Are you going more than 2 to 3 times a day? Are you not going are you not going once a day at all? Like, so you're more on the constipation side of things. Are you having difficulty digesting any particular macronutrient like protein, fiber, like fiber as in carbohydrates, or fat? Because all of that can indicate something else. So that is like, again, I'm saying all of that because that is digestively speaking. But then you can have, minimal digestive issues and still have a really poor gut microbiome. And what that literally means is that the organisms that reside in your microbiome could be of not not so much like symbiotic in nature, that relationship. Symbiotic meaning that you both benefit, you like as the host and the organism. It could be more like parasitic in nature, where it's like only that microbe benefits, and in turn it can release some kind of gnarly toxins in your body. So you're not benefiting, but that particular bacteria is. And so I feel like women with PCOS tend to have a microbiome that is more where the composition is more like that parasitic relationship versus that symbiotic relationship. So to answer your question in a roundabout way, I do like to make that distinction, number one. And number two, yes, you can have PCOS and have a poor gut microbiome. You can have PCOS, have a poor gut microbiome, and have digestive issues on top of that, which is what I had. My kind of all the different IBS type of symptoms. Yeah. Does that answer the question, or do you feel like I should expand on that a little bit more?
No, that does make sense. So if you don't have symptoms, then like what else? Like how else would you know? So I guess it's safe to say that most people that have PCOS most likely have impaired gut. But then if you don't have symptoms, like how do you know? Or like,
yeah,
like
so
what,
if you don't have symptoms,
like why should you be concerned? Or
yeah, great question. So if you don't have like obvious digestive symptoms, you're like, well, no, I never get gas. I don't ever bloat. I can digest all my food fine. My stool is like normal consistency. It's well formed. Then we get that, there are tests that we could run potentially in my practice. I offer a couple different types of microbiome stool tests. So if we really wanted to do a deep dive, we could. These are tests that you can do at home, which is super convenient. But you basically do have to mail in a stool sample. Directly to the lab, they'll process it, and technology is pretty advanced these days. So the lab can give us a full kind of printout of what your microbiome looks like. And at that point, we can assess for trends, right? We can say, okay, all of these species, they're kind of what we call the bad guys. We don't want a lot of these guys. So we have to, implement strategies so we can shift the pattern so that a lot of these other good guys can start to flourish. And in turn, we'll start to see pretty dramatic results, again, not only with the microbiome piece of it, but also that'll translate pretty quickly into like the metabolic parameters that we're looking at, like cholesterol, weight. And then reproductive symptoms as well, like lack of period and things like that.
Wow, interesting. A lot of information that comes just from the stool sample.
Yep.
So what if like I don't know that many people that get stool samples done. Like, is there still something you can do to improve your gut?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's why I like to test. I do a lot of like functional testing in my practice because I think it serves as not only number one, like data. I feel like a lot of clients that I work with are are just like me, like they're very data driven,
Mhm.
analytical. It obviously has to do with like my science background.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
So I like to see you know, what's going on in my body. And then
Mhm.
once I have that awareness of what's going on,
Yeah.
then I'm more motivated and more willing to make the necessary changes. Versus, you know, if I were to just say to a client, okay, I recommend you make these changes without any of this information, I do feel like there is an issue with compliance at times, just because they're
Yeah.
like, well, what am I doing? Like, what am I doing this for? And how long do
Right.
I have to do this for? So I do think it just helps to put a lot of information
Mhm.
into perspective, into it, like gives them that perspective that they need to make that change.
Yeah, that makes sense, definitely.
Yeah.
Um, so are there like your recommendations, like dietary or lifestyle that we can do to improve our gut health, which in
Yeah,
turn would help with PCOS?
absolutely.